We will open today with the first of our presentations, and I'd like to introduce to you Professor Piers Robinson from the University of Sheffield, where he is Chair of Politics, Society and Political Journalism. Piers has written some fantastic literature, including a treatise on the Chilcot Report and a book entitled The Handbook of Media, Conflict and Security. Tonight, Professor Robinson will discuss propaganda, deception and the war on terror from 9/11 to Syria. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Robinson.
Okay, I'll just check this technology works before I start. There we go. Okay. Welcome to everybody for coming tonight. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. My presentation is titled Media Failure, Government Propaganda and the War on Terror from 9/11 to Syria. And what I'm going to try and do over the course of the next 15-20 minutes is to try and give some context for the remaining speakers who come after me. And first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about academic insight into the reason why media comes to fail or can come to fail to play its democratic role in terms of informing the public about what's going on. And I'm going to talk through some of the key factors which academics identify which act as constraints on the mainstream media. I'm then going to use that to segue into a discussion about propaganda and about the problem of propaganda in contemporary liberal democracies. And part of that will be about trying to talk about sort of exactly what propaganda is, exactly why we in the West seem to have such a limited grasp on the importance of propaganda and the manipulation of information around us, and then use it to also just give you an idea of some of the key propaganda techniques which are used within liberal democracies. And then in the latter part of my presentation, I'm going to talk through recent research findings which I've been publishing in the last couple of years, looking at the Chilcot Report in particular, and looking in particular at the war on terror. And what I'm going to do in that second part of the presentation is to try to give some kind of geopolitical context for the conflicts that we've seen over the last 16, 17 years, and hopefully some very important context regarding the propaganda that we all seem to have been subjected to over the last 16 years, and also an insight into the reality of what's been going on in countries such as Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So that's what I'll try and do, and I will try as much as I can to keep to time. First of all, talking about media failure, why does the media fail to live up to its democratic expectations in liberal democracies? Some of you will be familiar with the propaganda model devised by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I strongly recommend that you go and take a look at it at some point, because their propaganda model of the media identifies really the major structural constraints which act on mainstream media in the West, and they're the kind of constraints which stop the media from really speaking truth to power and really giving us an accurate understanding of what's happening in the international system. And they run through a series of filters. I don't want to go into too much detail on these filters, but I'll run through the main ones before I get to what I think is a critical filter that we need to think about when we're thinking about propaganda. But Herman and Chomsky argued that, first of all, if you look at the mainstream media in the West, you're looking at a mainstream media which is dominated by corporations, large concentration of ownership and profit orientation. These are all part of big, powerful economic entities. And that's the first step in starting to understand the potential constraints, because the location of the mass media within large corporations and the overlap of interests between those corporations and governments means that the mainstream media is essentially limited in its ability to challenge those power blocks in society. So whilst there might be a fierce degree of debate in the media over certain issues and so on, it doesn't tend to start to press or to challenge powerful elements within society. The second filter they identify is the reliance upon advertising. The reliance upon advertising makes the media extremely or acutely risk-averse in society. Should I pause for a second?
Yeah, just pleasure, sir. It's fine. Then we'll just carry on. We'll sort this out.
Yeah.
would just like to point out that these people that are defending freedom of speech in Syria are the ones that dropped skunk water in here. That is a Zionist practice. This is a Christian church that they desecrated. These are extremist supporters in this hall of free speech. Imagine these people given Grad missiles or machine guns. This is the level of extremism that the Syrian people are tolerating and living through every day of their lives. Thank you also for the support from the audience during that.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys, for standing up there. Meet Syria Solidarity UK. They've turned up to several events and sabotaged them like this, so we're sorry that's happened. We're now going to continue on with Professor Robinson's fantastic talk.
Okay. Okay, so just before I was interrupted, I was talking about reliance upon advertising and mainstream media reliance upon advertising, and advertisers are acutely risk averse and so on, and that creates a pressure on the kind of news coverage which you see emanating from mainstream media. Some of you are probably familiar with Peter Oborne's experience in the last couple of years with the Telegraph newspaper and his resignation from the Telegraph because it wouldn't run stories in relation to the HSBC scandal and so on. And that was a key advertiser with the Telegraph, which gives you an example of those kind of pressures which can come to bear. Away from these economic constraints which act upon the mainstream media, we have the issue of flack, criticism which gets hurled up at journalists who do start to push at the boundaries and to raise critical issues and so on. Flack being fired up from think tanks and so on, PR outlets, etc., in order to discipline journalists, to intimidate them away from dealing with certain issues. And Herman Chomsky talked also about the importance of anti-communism, at least during the Cold War era, as creating an ideological bond between journalists and policymakers, which meant that they tended to see international politics through the same lens, through the same Cold War lens. So, for example, journalists who were covering the Vietnam War could only see it through the lens of the Cold War, that they were fighting communists, and could never understand it as a conflict against a group of people within Vietnam who were fighting for national self-determination. Of course, there are new ideological filters, as neoliberalism, for example. There's also the war on terror, which I'll be talking about later, which has similar ideological effects in terms of simplifying the world and creating a bond between journalists and policymakers. So those are the kind of factors which they identify in the propaganda model. The most important one, however, and I'm going to use this now to start talking about propaganda, is actually what is one of the most well-documented and well-established facts in political communication research, which is that journalists, when they're constructing the news, rely heavily upon official sources in order to work out what's going on in the world, and also they rely upon official sources to provide a steady flow of news and information. And this propensity, this tendency of mainstream journalists to use and defer to political elites means that they are acutely vulnerable to propaganda campaigns and the kind of propaganda campaigns that governments engage in, especially in the realm of international affairs, especially during wartime. Propaganda. Let's talk about propaganda. What is propaganda? I'm going to offer a definition here just to give it a little bit of understanding about exactly what we mean. Propaganda involves coordinated approaches to influencing beliefs and behavior and conduct. Okay, so it's organized, it's a directed, intentional activity. And critically, it's not a consensual process. It's not a two-way attempt to persuade people to think in a particular way about an issue. It's essentially, primarily, some kind of manipulative process which appeals to emotions or irrational desires, etc., or involves, at the last point on that slide, some degree of deception or manipulation of information. Propaganda isn't always about deception, but it frequently is, and a lot of the examples which I talk about later on in the talk will be deception-related and so on. But it doesn't just involve deception, but it is essentially, and this is the key point, about a non-consensual process of manipulating people to get them to think or act in a way that they wouldn't act otherwise if they hadn't been subjected to that propaganda. Now, of course, when we talk about propaganda in the West, for a lot of people, perhaps not so many of the people in this audience, but for a lot of people, this doesn't seem to fit. We don't think that we live in a world which is highly propagandized. And when we think of propaganda, we tend to think of these things. So you got a couple of examples there from Nazi propaganda from the Second World War, some US propaganda from the First World War. That's the kind of sort of ideas or images which come to mind when people think of the word propaganda. It's something which happened back there in history and so on. More recently, and I guess with the current debates we've had over the last couple of years regarding fake news and so on, people have come to associate or to use the term propaganda in relation to controversial political actors such as Donald Trump or Nigel Farage. And of course, at the moment, we're in the middle of an extensive debate, crisis, etc., about Russian propaganda and about Russian attempts to influence Western minds and so on. So people are thinking of these things when they hear propaganda, and they're thinking of perhaps propaganda from history, or they're thinking of propaganda coming from external actors or controversial stroke extreme political actors within our own political system. We call it fake news now, but really what we're talking about there is propaganda. But of course, we are actually subjected to propaganda through more legitimate, in inverted commas, media outlets, and from more legitimate, in inverted commas, political leaders. And so a couple of examples there in terms of the political sphere. There's an image there of George Bush having landed aboard an aircraft carrier, mission accomplished at the end of the Iraq War. And the propaganda message which they were trying to articulate there was to send a clear message to the American public that the Iraq War was over, it was done and dusted. And they were also trying to send a clear message to the Iraqi population that they should bow down and accept what had happened to their country. It was a carefully crafted George Bush landing Top Gun style on board an American aircraft carrier and then addressing the world, so to speak. This was carefully designed in order to manipulate perceptions into an understanding that the war in Iraq was over at that point, which, as we all know, that war goes on to this day. In the bottom right-hand corner, perhaps we're more used to sort of manipulation in the commercial sphere, but that's a bit of commercial propaganda there, trying to create an association between cigarette smoking and a benign, positive aspect of life, love, etc. Don't be a maybe, be a Marlboro. So we are subjected to propaganda, but we don't tend to recognize it as such. And this, in some ways, is rather odd in contemporary liberal democracies, because historically, propaganda was widely discussed. And here you have Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud. And he was a group of intellectual thinkers from the early part of the 20th century who spoke extensively about the importance of propaganda in order to mobilize and manage populations in a democracy. The conscious manipulation, intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is key to democracy. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. So this was widely discussed in the early part of the 20th century amongst intellectuals and academics, the importance of propaganda. But this over time has been erased from our minds, or has been removed from the public consciousness that we are subject to propaganda. There are concentrated reasons for this. Eddie Bernays, here's a quote from Eddie Bernays himself, saying that propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans and the way they had used it in the First World War. So what we did was to find a new form of words, PR, public relations. That's where public relations come from. It was a way of rebranding propaganda so that people were not so aware of the manipulation that they were being subjected to. Many people who work in the field of PR studies and so on are blissfully oblivious to the fact that their whole academic research area was actually formally called propaganda. And it's always great fun pointing that out to them sometimes at conferences. But over time, as Phil Taylor, the war media historian, pointed out and argued, that we've had a euphemism industry which has developed over time. We have a wide range of terms which governments use to explain activities, and I won't read through all of them because I don't have time. We have terms such as psychological operations, strategic communication, influence operations, political warfare, and all of these terms, as Phil Taylor pointed out, are really euphemisms. They're a way of democratic governments and powerful actors within democracies essentially sort of hiding away the fact that they are engaged in manipulation activities, they are engaged in propaganda. A euphemism industry which has led to This wonderful quote here from Carey in his book, Taking the Risk Out of Democracy, Corporate Propaganda versus Freedom and Liberty. Success of business propaganda in persuading us that we are free from propaganda is one of the most significant achievements of the 20th century. So in a very fundamental way, we have had the idea that we are in a society where we are being manipulated, removed from our consciousness and removed from our minds. Now, I'm going to give just a couple of minutes just to give you a little bit of an insight into the rationale that you come across from various stratas within the political establishment, which explains why they believe that propaganda needs to be used in democracies. And this is John Mearsheimer, who's a leading American IR, international relations theorist. And he wrote a book in 2010, Why Leaders Lie. And he argues that deception is widely seen as a necessary component of achieving strategic objectives in the international system. And he makes this wonderfully counterintuitive point that actually countries or states rarely lie to each other. Governments rarely lie to each other because they have intelligence services who can actually work out what the truth of what is going on. But they do frequently lie to their own populations. And there's a kind of an elitist underpinning to this, is that foreign policy elites are there to decide what is in the national interest, what strategic objectives have to be pursued in the international system, and that they're the best place to work out what needs to be done. And you want to keep the public away or keep the public on side through propaganda frequently. And he argues that liberal democracies, and this is perhaps his most controversial point, is that liberal democracies in the international system, whilst they present themselves as benign forces, etc., they do frequently engage in actions in the international system which are fundamentally illiberal. And in order to do that, in order to carry the population with foreign policies which are illiberal and immoral, they will engage in propaganda campaigns to tell positive stories about why they are acting in the international system in the way that they are. Finally, and I'm slightly conscious of time, we did have an interruption. How am I doing for time? I'm fine. Okay, I'm fine. There is an ideological underpinning, and I sometimes think I'm going to ditch this quote for talks and so on, but it's too good a one to avoid. This is Crystal, a neoconservative, talking about truths appropriate for the sophisticated in society and truths appropriate for students and children and sort of lower strata within society. And he says at the end there that sort of the idea in a democracy that all these truths are the same thing is just a lie. It simply doesn't work in a democracy. And what Crystal is really harking back to there is Plato's concept of the noble lie, the idea that there are different stratas in society, and in order to maintain cohesion of society, you do have to engage in systematic propaganda and storytelling to help explain different groups in society why they occupy the positions in society that they do. And these 2 points here, or these 2 slides here, just give you a little bit of an insight into the rationale which underpins the belief in the use of propaganda. This is why we see propaganda being used, because we have people who maintain that position, or from a more practical point of view, people in the foreign policy establishment who just feel that what needs to be done in the international system needs to be sugar-coated for domestic populations. A little bit about propaganda techniques. Lying, people often associate propaganda with lying, the idea of the big lie, the Nazi lie, and so on. But as the German proverb goes, lies have short legs. It tends to be a fairly ineffective way of engaging in propaganda. The political costs associated with being found out in a lie tend to be fatal. So what you tend to find is in a lot of propaganda activities, you see more subtle forms of manipulation of information, distortion of information, exaggeration, and omission of information. And we saw this very clearly in the run-up to the Iraq War with the debates or the arguments over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And essentially what the British government was involved in was cherry-picking evidence, removing inconvenient facts from the intelligence reports, exaggerating aspects of those intelligence reports in order to create a much greater perception of the threat posed by Iraq's alleged WMD. Misdirection is another classic technique. Getting people to focus on some other issue to take them away from an issue at home. Russiagate at the moment and the focus on Russia and Russian propaganda is arguably, and will probably turn out to be, a very major example of misdirection, trying to take political attention away from politics within the West and put all the blame onto Russia and so on. A couple of further things. When people think of propaganda, they tend to think of PR campaigns, they think of deception, they think of manipulation of information. But propaganda also involves incentivization. It also involves coercive processes. And just as an example of coercive processes, surrender leaflets dropped into war zones, trying to get people to surrender with the implicit threat that force will be used if they don't surrender. Those are seen as part of military psyops and military propaganda. But clearly the coercive meaning of those messages is underpinned by the credible presence of military force and the threat of military force. And a surprising amount of propaganda at the deeper levels does work on that level in terms of coercing people, not just fooling people, but also pressurizing people into acting and behaving in particular ways. Propaganda production and dissemination, written and spoken and visual communication through PR campaigns. I've suggested before that's how often people think of propaganda, etc. But also, propaganda seems to emerge through production of knowledge. Academia, journalists themselves, think tanks can all be caught up and all involved in varying degrees of intentionality in propaganda campaigns. A difficult pill to swallow for academics, a difficult pill to swallow for journalists, for sure. But it's true that there is a degree of penetration into these parts of society which catch them in or involve them with propaganda activities which are being pushed and promoted. And some of the later presentations today, I think, will highlight some of these aspects of propaganda. But propaganda comes out of the production of knowledge through some of these institutions within society. And finally, before I get on to Chilcot, action in the real world. Propaganda is not just about messages, it's not just about the production of knowledge, it's also about doing things in the real world. A very good example of that is the shock and awe strategy in Iraq, and people would probably remember at the start of the Iraq invasion in 2003, the high-profile bombing of government buildings in central Baghdad. That was primarily designed to send a coercive message to the Iraqi population that they should not resist the invasion. It was part of the shock and awe strategy. It was primarily a psyop or a propaganda act. So propaganda also involves doing things as well as saying things, etc. Okay, I want to move now to, in the closing section of this talk, to talk about Chilcot Report. Chilcot Report is an area which I've been researching for 5 years, and I'm going to draw upon Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns here, for those of you who are familiar with that. There are known knowns which have been confirmed by Chilcot in terms of deception and manipulation, and the one there is the one that most of you are probably familiar with, which is the manipulation of intelligence, which I've already mentioned. We know now that there was deliberate propaganda campaign designed to hype the sense of a threat from Iraqi WMD and the headlines produced there. But there are unknown unknowns or known unknowns. Decide which one you want to pick on that one in relation to the war on terror, and that's what I'm going to focus on in the closing few minutes. The Chilcot Report, and this was really very much missed by the mainstream media, the Chilcot Report gave critical information about the emergence of the war on terror, which gives us a powerful insight into the propaganda campaign and the realities of the war on terror. And this is what the Chilcot Report gave us information about for people who actually went through the report and through the details of section 3.1. Here you have a communication from the British Embassy 3 days after 9/11 stating that the regime change hawks in Washington are arguing that a coalition put together to fight the war on terror can be used to clean up other problems in the region. So straight away you have an indication that the war on terror was not simply about what it was claimed to be, which was fighting Al-Qaeda and so on. It was also about doing some geostrategic heavy lifting or taking advantage of 9/11 and Islamic fundamentalism in order to do that. By December 2001, you have documents showing Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the war on terror being planned, and a list of countries there identified for various degrees of action. Here's a document from Tony Blair to George Bush talking about how they might go about toppling Saddam Hussein without a full-blown invasion. And there's reference there to covert operations, trying to stir up uprisings and then militarily intervening when those uprisings occurred. An indicator there, I think, to the possibility of what we've seen in Syria over the last 6 years. Here you have, and this is more damning, here you have Syria and Iran being discussed with Tony Blair saying to George Bush, if the priority is to take out Saddam, then maybe we should do so with Iran and Syria acquiescing rather than hitting all three countries at once. Here you have clear plotting and planning covertly in order to engage in regime change operations in a document from Tony Blair to George Bush. Here you have reference to the propaganda campaign. So politicians don't use propaganda in public, but they do use it in private. And there's reference there by Tony Blair to the need for a tight-knit propaganda campaign. This is another document from an aide from Tony Blair to Condoleezza Rice talking about propaganda activities in the context of the war on terror, the rapid rebuttal, the grid being pushed out, which is an Alistair Campbell device, and so on. And then planning the propaganda campaign, a whole host of activities. For example, humanitarian conference is the first one on the list. And if you look at the first line there, and the terms being used is that this is how to make people in the world think that something good can come from 9/11 and so on. These are all part of the activities to underpin, essentially, an aggressive series of regime change operations. And this confirms, and I'm going to show this clip now, this confirms, essentially, Wesley Clark's claims, which were made in 2006, which I want to play to you.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Okay. I'm going to run through the next 2 clips. I don't really have time to be talking through these, but just very quickly, Sir Richard Dearlove, if you stop that from playing, yeah.
About Saudi Arabia.
Sorry. So I'm not going to play this clip, but this is a reference from Sir Richard Dearlove. Take the mic off. There we go. This is a reference from Sir Richard Dearlove a couple of years ago talking about a conversation he had with Prince Bandar prior to 9/11, with Prince Bandar clearly indicating the potential emergence of a major conflict within the Middle East and so on. Don't have time to play that clip, but it's very important that you have someone such as Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, passing that information out. And it all really sort of underpins and reinforces the remainder of the information from Chilcot that there was clearly regime change planning going on immediately after 9/11. Okay. So I'm just going to be just very clear about what we're seeing here in these documents. We're seeing the leaders of 2 democratic countries. We are seeing them plotting to engage in illegal regime change war operations, wars of aggression, and engaging in planning a propaganda campaign to underpin that. Okay. Concluding comments from what I've been running through today. Propaganda clearly is extensive in liberal democracies, and the case of the Iraq War and the War on Terror demonstrates that that's the case. It's extensive in liberal democracies, and it's arguable that there is a permanent and significant displacement of reality because of these propaganda campaigns. The War on Terror itself is quite clear from Chilcot and from the insights of people such as Wesley Clark, but also Sir Richard Dearlove, is that the War on Terror has essentially been a geostrategic agenda probably aimed at influence and resources. It's been coordinated in an alliance with key allies in the Middle East, and it's essentially been involved in doing some heavy lifting in the international system, attacking countries who are opposed to the West, invading those countries, and I don't need to add, in the remainder of the presentations we'll talk about this, causing huge loss of life in countries which have been targeted. My final point, Western exploitation and use of Islamic fundamentalism in order to underpin these regime change operations mean that in a very fundamental sense, the war on terror itself, from its inception right through to today, can be understood essentially as a propaganda campaign which has been designed to mobilize Western publics to support these wars which we've been seeing unfolding for the last 16 years. Thank you.